Did medieval lords really have the right to your wife?
For centuries, people believed one terrifying story about the Middle Ages, a story so disturbing that it still appears in movies, TV shows, and history discussions today. According to the legend, when a peasant couple got married in medieval Europe, the local lord could legally take the bride for himself on her wedding night. It was called the rite of the first night, and millions of people still believe it really happened. But what if one of the most infamous facts in medieval history was actually a lie? What if this story survived for hundreds of years, not because it was true, but because it was useful? The truth behind this medieval myth is darker, stranger, and far more shocking than most people realize. Because this isn't just a story about sex or power. It's a story about propaganda, fear, revolution, and how entire generations can be manipulated into believing something that may never have existed at all. And the craziest part? Historians today still argue about it. The legend was known by several names: jus primae noctis, droit du seigneur, or simply the right of the first night. According to the story, feudal lords across medieval Europe supposedly had the legal authority to sleep with a peasant bride before her husband could. The idea appears in stories connected to France, Scotland, Germany, and parts of Spain and Italy. By the 1700s, many Europeans already accepted it as historical fact. Writers described it, politicians repeated it, audiences were horrified by it. But there was one massive problem. Historians could barely find any actual medieval laws proving it existed. Think about that for a second. Medieval Europe recorded everything: taxes, land ownership, marriage contracts, punishments, church law, royal decrees. Yet one of the most brutal legal rights supposedly practiced for centuries left almost no direct legal evidence behind. That alone has made historians suspicious for decades. In fact, many modern scholars now believe that widespread legal first night rights probably never existed in the way movies portray them. So where did the story come from? To answer that, you have to understand medieval power. Life for peasants during the Middle Ages was already extremely unfair. Lords controlled land, courts, taxes, food production, and military protection. Peasants often paid fees just to marry. In some regions, a marriage tax known as a merchet had to be paid to the lord when a daughter married. Historians think these payments may have helped create the myth later on. Imagine being forced to pay money to your local lord before your wedding. Over generations, stories grow darker. A tax becomes a humiliation. Humiliation becomes a rumor, and eventually rumor becomes history. But that's only part of the story, because the myth truly exploded centuries later during one of the most violent periods in European history, the French Revolution. Revolutionary writers wanted the public to hate the aristocracy. And nothing creates rage faster than the image of rich nobles violating ordinary families. Pamphlets, speeches, and political propaganda began portraying feudal lords as monsters who abused peasants however they wanted. The right of the first night became a perfect symbol of aristocratic corruption. Even if the historical evidence was weak emotionally, it felt true. And emotional stories spread faster than facts. But here's where things become even stranger. While historians doubt that there was ever a universal legal right across Europe, that does not mean abuse never happened. In reality, some local rulers absolutely abused their power. Medieval peasants had little protection against violent nobles. In isolated regions, coercion and sexual violence almost certainly occurred. But historians distinguish between isolated abuse and an official legal system practiced everywhere. That distinction matters, because over time, fiction blurred together with reality. By the 1800s, famous writers and artists helped cement the myth permanently into popular culture. Plays, novels, and operas dramatized cruel lords claiming brides on their wedding nights. Audiences loved it because it confirmed their belief that the Middle Ages were barbaric and primitive. And then Hollywood amplified it even further. One of the most famous examples came in the 1995 movie Braveheart. where English nobles are shown enforcing first night rites in Shotlandia. The scenes were unforgettable. There was just one issue. Historians say there's no strong evidence the policy existed there either. Yet millions of viewers walked away believing it was historical fact. This is how myths survive. Not because they are proven, but because they are emotionally powerful. And honestly, that may be the most disturbing part of the entire story. Human beings are incredibly vulnerable to narratives that confirm what they already want to believe. Medieval Europe already had a reputation for cruelty, disease, torture, and inequality. So when people heard about the right of the first night, it fit perfectly into that image. Nobody questioned it, but the deeper historians investigated, the more complicated the story became. Some medieval texts mentioning the practice turned out to be satire or political criticism rather than legal evidence. Other references appeared centuries after the Middle Ages ended. Some stories were copied from earlier myths and repeated until they sounded true. In many cases, historians discovered that supposed evidence was incredibly weak once examined closely. Yet the myth refused to die. And maybe that's because the story reveals something timeless about power itself. Even if there was never an official law allowing lords to claim brides, ordinary people understood that powerful men often acted as though they were above the law. The myth survived because it reflected a deeper emotional truth about inequality and fear. Peasants feared their rulers. Women were vulnerable. Justice was inconsistent, and people with power often escaped consequences. In that sense, the legend felt believable because parts of medieval life truly were terrifying. But the biggest twist may be this. The rite of the first night tells us less about the Middle Ages than it does about the centuries that came afterward. Enlightenment thinkers used it to portray medieval society as backward. Revolutionaries used it to attack aristocrats. Filmmakers used it to create drama. Modern audiences use it as proof that humanity has progressed. Every generation reshaped the myth for its own purposes, which raises an uncomfortable question. If entire civilizations can believe a story for hundreds of years with little evidence, what modern facts might future historians discover were exaggerated too? Because history is not just a collection of truths, it's a battlefield of narratives. And the stories that survive are often the ones people emotionally want to believe. So did medieval lords really have the legal right to take brides on their wedding night? Most historians today would say probably not in the widespread, official way the legend describes. But the reason the myth survived for centuries reveals something just as important. Human beings don't just believe stories because they are true. They believe stories because they are powerful. And sometimes, the most dangerous myths are the ones that feel real enough to never be questioned.